At your leisure, Allison.
All righty. Thank you all for being here today. Really appreciate your participation in this group. We've got some meaty topics for the UDO Advisory Committee. And I don't we have a good number of you, but we're definitely missing a lot of folks today. So hopefully they roll in a little bit later. I wanted to take a minute and just kind of make sure we know who all's in the room before we start the presentation. So I'm Allison Craig, I'm the planning director, and from the planning staff, I've got Alan Goodwin, Laura Harmon, and Andrew Ossel. Going through my list: Solomon Fortune, Mariah Wozniak, Dave Petton, Sandy Montgomery, Kevin May, Catherine Mahoney, let's see, and Lisa McCarter. And Will Linville. CDOT, we've got Tracy Newsom, and we have, it looks like we may have just gotten Josh, which I think is Josh Weaver with planning. And then we have Douglas Welton is our chair of our planning commission. And then I'm seeing from the UAC, I've got Tony Lathrop, Rob Nanfelt, Roger Manley, Eric Severl, Matt Langston, Julie Porter, Dennis Rory, Mark Laughlin, John Morris. I see two Dennises, and I think that's it. Did I leave anybody out that didn't call your name? All right. Well, Alan, I think we can pull up the presentation. All right, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so I brought this up last time, just reminding you all why you're here. And I just want to reiterate that this is a really important group. What we do is we sort of, as we think about changes to the UDO, what we do before we really even go out and talk to council and talk to the community with a baked idea, we test ideas here with you all. And so you're a volunteer committee. We actually had a lot of applications to join the UDO advisory committee, and you all were selected because we wanted to hear the diverse perspectives from the neighborhood groups, environmental groups, designers, and development professionals. And so that's really what you are here for, is for us to bounce ideas off of you and to get some initial vetting before we start going into the community. So we are this month are talking to you all about duplexes and triplexes. If you could go to the next slide. So last week, what we talked about was a city council referral. So I mentioned this last week that we were requested by city council to take a look at potentially modifying development standards when we're looking at by right development for large residential subdivisions. And we talked a little bit about what does large look like, and that we talked a little bit about, is that 2+ acres, 5+ acres. So that was last week. If you did not take a look at that, or if you did not participate, and you're maybe on the video today, or you're on the call today, or you're watching it later, please go back and review that. That's a really important conversation that involves potentially requiring a mix of uses or introducing density caps for subdivisions of single-family duplexes and triplexes. Today, what we're going to talk about is infill lots. So this is if you, in your neighborhood, your neighbor sells their house, and the new person that buys the house wants to tear it down and build a duplex or a triplex. These are all the standards that relate to that situation. So that's what we mean by infill. It's an individual lot in a community. Often, sometimes you can convert existing building into a duplex or triplex, but generally speaking, it's a tear down and then it's replaced by a duplex or triplex. Next slide. So wanted to show some pictures just to talk about and kind of get you all thinking about these structures. And because ultimately later on in the presentation, we're going to start showing you some site plans, but I know that not everyone really relates to a site plan where, we like to think about pictures. It's just easier for us all to relate to. And so, and we'll kind of, I'm going to have a few of these sort of spread throughout. And so what we're really trying to talk to you about is, how do they fit into the existing neighborhoods? What can we regulate and what can we not regulate? And how can we ensure that that we are providing what's really needed across Charlotte in terms of housing options, but while also maintaining the character of our existing neighborhoods. This conversation was really important throughout the comprehensive plan and through the Unified Development Ordinance. And the last week's conversation was really about bringing in more density in the form of subdivisions, but this is as much about density as it is providing housing options. And so as our lifestyles change, as our families change, as our living needs change, we may not always want to live in a single family home or an apartment. And there are other housing types that we have underbuilt for decades that include duplexes, triplexes, quads, townhomes, et cetera. And that's what this is really about. So I kind of wanted to address another, as we talk about existing in the or fitting into existing neighborhoods, we have seen a triplex development that has we've seen a couple introductions. They've been right now in South Charlotte that I think a lot of people have heard of. So I just wanted to bring it forward. And so this is a triplex development that I think is creating a lot of conversation, because I don't think it's as much the height or the scale of the development, but I mean, we all can talk about that as well. But I think it's a lot about parking and driveways and what does that look like. And so that's kind of where we're going to focus our conversation today, is really talking about how the parking and the driveways for structures are, and as you introduce more units, how that relates to the community that's already existing. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we've heard a lot of things about scale. We've heard about stormwater. That's been a topic that's been discussed a lot recently, because there are additional stormwater requirements that have been introduced into the UDO, and that's because we've heard some concerns about flooding and drainage in our residential neighborhoods, and wanting to account for that. We've also heard some issues about how this fire access on when you have additional units, because that's in a lot of ways the fire department views the structures a little bit differently from a single family home to a duplex or a triplex. How are we ensuring that we've got tree-lined streets? Is there a locational criteria? So we've heard some of those things, but today we really want to focus on the parking and driveways, as I mentioned earlier. Next. So I want to be really clear before I show some additional pictures, and make sure that you all understand what we can and cannot regulate, because I think this is really important, in that when we start showing pictures, you may like the building from an architectural standpoint, or you may hate it, but there are some things that we cannot regulate. And so I want to make sure that when we're starting to talk about preferences and things that we want to keep or want to change, that we cannot regulate building design elements for structures that are subject to the North Carolina Residential Code. And there's some nuances to this, but generally speaking, that has meant duplexes and single family homes. Until recently, there was a bill that was passed in June of 2023 that extended that to triplexes and quads. And so, so when we start talking about that, it means that we can't tell you what color your house is, or what type of or style of external cladding, the style of materials of your roof pitches or your porches. We can't regulate the location of your windows, your doors, or your garage doors, the number and the types of room, interior layout. And also too, it's not really part of this bill, but we also cannot regulate home ownership or rental. So just as we start to look at that, I wanted to make that clear. So a couple of examples, and you can go to the next slide, Alan. So some of the conversation that we've been having has been about about how the driveways, the dimensional standards for the driveways. And so if you look at the image on the left, this right now in the UDO, and we'll kind of get into some of the actual numeric details of this, but we limit the width of the front driveway. And the reason for that is we want to reduce the amount of reduce the amount of impervious surface and enhance the pedestrian environment and really maintain this pedestrian focused tree lined street. So on the left, that's an example of a duplex that has 2 front driveways for a single car, and that is currently allowed under the UDO. Some of the things that we've been hearing from residents and from the development community is that that a single car garage is not always desirable, and there is an interest in having double width front driveways, which is not allowed under the UDO because the limitation that we have for the driveway width would not allow a double width front driveway. Yes, Roger.
So when we talk about tree line streets, just not really conversant in the single family districts, but the trees would in those street standards, pedscape standards, setbacks are still between the sidewalk and the street, right?
Yeah, yes, the frontage requirements, right?
So so the concern here is that because the driveways are wider, there's just less opportunity for the trees to go there. I mean, I'm kind of wondering if the civils know, does that actually, because there's going to be a certain spacing of trees anyways, does that actually diminish the tree capacity or the tree density?
I think, of course, it's going to depend on the lot width and all of the other parameters related to the actual site design. And so it will depend, but as you introduce more pavement, there's less green area, which means there's less ability to plant a tree. Matt.
Morning. Yeah, I know Bartlett Labs down in Steel Creek has done some studies on root space availability and its sort of impact on canopy size over time. One of the things that I wanted to mention is there's a lot of structural solutions that exist where you can add substrate under driveways that provides air space and root space and water space and soil space that allows, I think one of the challenges that we sometimes have is the tree regulations have a certain minimum root zone requirement. And perhaps if there was more flexibility of allowing some of those structural solutions, it might allow trees to, because trees function in urban environments all the time. And it might be a way to, sort of meet in the middle where we're giving the trees a better shot with less space, but it's allowing, more reasonable function of the driveways. But there've been some studies about it.
Yeah, and that would be great. And like when I'm looking at these two examples, what I wanted to bring forward that it's certainly about trees and green area, but it's also about the pedestrian environment, which we'll get into in a moment. And so the question for the group is to really think about when you start to, double the amount of driveway frontage on the front of the home. And if you think about these in an existing neighborhood, is that something that you're comfortable with? So that's really what we wanted to point out here. Next slide. So a couple of other examples. These are duplexes and with parking in the front and or to the rear and on street. And this, of course, is allowed in the UDO. Same thing onto the picture on the right. This is a duplex actually down the street from my house. Parking and driveways are to the side of the structure, and this is also allowed. This is an example on Kings Drive. This is a horseshoe driveway on an arterial street. This is not allowed under the UDO, but this is something that you'll see a little bit later in the presentation that we are considering, just wanting to account for the fact that having a driveway, not wanting to back a car onto an arterial street may not be the most safe thing for us. Next slide. And then looking at triplexes. So again, because we have a driveway width maximum, and this is in feet and as a percentage of the lot frontage, you would not be able to do a double width front driveway for each of the 3 units for a triplex, nor would you be able to do a single width front driveway under the UDO. And so I think with one of the earlier pictures that I showed, I think that's just one of the challenges that we're experiencing with triplexes is really managing the car requirements, which I'm sure Eric is. I would assume that he's thinking, well, what if we just don't have parking requirements? Which I'm with you. But even still, I think from how these are actually utilized, whether you change your parking requirements or not, you still have 3 families with it, probably, at least 3 cars, if not more, and then trying to understand how you're allowing for those cars and the interaction with the pedestrian environment and the structure within an existing neighborhood. So even today, we wouldn't allow a double or a single width front driveway for a triplex just because of the amount of driveway width in the frontage. Next slide. This is allowed parking and driveways to the side or rear, of course. So this is allowed under the UDO. Next slide. Just kind of wanted to, I've mentioned most of these things. You can go to the next slide. It's just what's the intent of the standards right now? So it's about walkability. It's about the pedestrian environment. Like, I think these structures look kind of cool, but I have concerns about the lack of green space between the structure and the street. It's just a lot of pavement, and it's probably not the place where I would choose to go on a walk. And then there's just conflicts between pedestrians and vehicles in this scenario. Next slide. We want to, as we mentioned before, provide adequate space for required tree planting. That is something that's really important in the comprehensive plan, is talking about these tree-lined streets as part of the pedestrian environment and our centers and our neighborhoods. It's an important thing for shade and temperature effects. And the wider driveways have greater stormwater impacts, which is something that we've also had a lot of conversations about, that there are stormwater impacts, and there's also some cost implications as we start to introduce wider driveways or bringing the driveways around the back, that we're trying to manage some of that. And then thirdly, landscape yards are often found front lawns between the residents and the street. This is common in our existing neighborhoods. And there is limited impervious cover between the residential buildings and the street. This is actually from the comprehensive plan and the neighborhood character goal. Next slide. Okay, so I am going to turn it over to, I think, Laura, to talk about the current standards. So you've seen a bunch of pictures. So now we're going to start showing you things that are have a lot more technical information in it, but I wanted to at least start with some pictures just to kind of give you a flavor of some of the things we were thinking about and what was allowed and not allowed. So I'll turn it over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Allison. First, we want to go through some pictures of what could be built under the UDO. And this is looking down at the site, like you're looking at a map. And currently our standards say that the maximum width of driveway and parking between the building and the street is 40% of the lot width. So if you have 100 foot wide lot, for example, which would be an awfully big lot, but there are some out there, that cumulative width would be 40 feet. But we also say up to a maximum of 24 feet in width. And basically 24 feet will get you 2 driveways. And you can see here with a duplex that you have 2 driveways coming to a garage in the duplex. And we do have a setback for the garage location to make sure or to minimize people parking over the sidewalk. But this is pretty standard for what we have in the UDO, which is allowing 2 single driveways for a duplex. If we go to the next slide. So when we get to a triplex, and I think this is where there's been a bit more challenge that we've been hearing about, is you can still have the same standards, and this is a mid-block triplex, and off of the street you can have 2 driveways again. And so if you maybe you might have all the parking in the rear with 1 driveway going to the rear. You could have 1 driveway going to a garage in the front and the rest of your parking to the rear, the way the standards are currently set up. So you're not having all of your parking in this case in the front. Next slide. So we also have the condition of corner lots. And in this case, you could actually get more driveways because you have 2 streets and you have additional driveways on your side street subject to the allowances and restrictions for the front of your lot. So if you could have 2 on the front of your lot, you could have 2 on the side. And what you're seeing in this picture is 3 units, a triplex, and 2 of them have garages accessed off of one street, and the 3rd unit has a garage accessed off your side street. And so that's bottom line what you can do today. But we are going to go through, and these are just some options, and you guys may have others or thoughts on this. We're going to go through a series of possible changes, potential changes to the standards related to this. As we go through them, you may want to grab a pen and piece of paper because we have numbered each one. It's 6 different options. And at the end, we're going to ask you some questions about which options do you like, which do you not like, and so forth. So we will jump right into it. So the first option, potential new standard, is that the driveway width wouldn't exceed 12 feet between the street, essentially street edge, and 5 feet behind the sidewalk or right of way. So what this is basically doing is keeping your, if you had a double driveway as you move further off the street, it's keeping it narrower where you would have that conflict across the sidewalk between vehicles and pedestrians. So the intent of this is to, again, minimize that conflict, make an area more walkable so that when you're on the sidewalk walking, occasionally you're going to be crossing a not very wide driveway. And potential standard number 2 is that all driveways and parking other than a driveway leading to a street-facing garage must be located to the side or rear of a building. So what this standard would do is if you didn't have, your driveway wasn't leading to a garage, you would not be able to have that driveway directly in front of a duplex or a triplex. You would have, and you couldn't have parking directly in front of a duplex or triplex. it would move your parking to the side or the rear. And this would limit what we're calling front yard parking. So potential standard number 3, and we can go back when we get through this. We're going to ask you if you have questions about what any of these meant. It will be first question. Parking standard number 3 is how many spaces in driveways going to the front facing garages could count towards your required parking spaces. So if you have 2 spaces per unit, you would not be able to count more than 1 space in the front outside of that garage. And that would discourage pushing a building back to create a long driveway to meet a parking requirement, which we have seen that happen recently. So, potential standard number 4 is to increase the maximum cumulative width of your driveways from 24 feet to 30 feet if you have a lot that is 75 feet wide or more. This would accommodate 3 single car garages or parking driveways that would lead to garages in the front, and would provide more flexible driveway standards than we currently have, where you saw earlier where this wasn't allowed currently for triplexes to have 3 driveways in the front. Our 4th standard is to, and this is another triplex example, we have what we call an established setback line. And that is basically wherever the closest part of a building is to the street, that's setting a line, and you can see it here, that unit 1 is setting a line, an established setback line. And what we're suggesting we could look at here is allowing a driveway to widen when that driveway is beyond the established setback line. So you can see here on the right-hand side, we have a 14-foot wide driveway. And then when you get past that established setback line, and that is established by one of the triplex units, you can widen out your driveway. So it's allowing some wider driveway area, but it is behind the front of that first unit and moving it somewhat out of what we call the public realm. And this would provide more flexibility for triplexes as another alternative. And then we have a special condition, what we're calling potential new standard, which would allow a horseshoe driveway off of an arterial street. And just to remind you, an arterial, we also call these thoroughfares. These are our bigger streets, more traffic, a lot of times higher speed, and the kind of street that you probably don't want to back your car onto if you can avoid it. So we had identified a standard that we could use that would allow what we're calling a horseshoe driveway, and off of that could come individual driveways to garages or to parking areas in the side or the back. And this again would help avoid backing onto arterials. You would, this would be a one-way driveway essentially, and you would pull in on one side and drive all the way around and come out straight on the other side. So that is another possibility as we're looking at potential adjustments for the driveway standards that we have. So Allison, I think I'm handing it back to you here.
Thanks, Laura. So I think I'll start with just a couple of these first questions about, do you have any questions about what we presented so far? Do you think we need to make changes at all? If so, which are the potential changes that you like or dislike? And so I'm going to stop with that and see what the group thinks. Feel free to just take yourself off mute, or raise your hand, whatever makes sense for you.
Allison, there's a rather lengthy comment from John Morris in the chat if you wanted to.
Okay, well, I'll start with that, and then I see Roger raise his hand. So Eric said it's also about the design of those homes having garages in the front and the impervious surfaces. Parking lots in the front of the home are not what we should be building, which I think skimmed John's comment. I don't like garages in the front either, but that's an aesthetic issue law. The state law does not allow us to regulate, and that is true. Stormwater is regulated by 2008 federal NPDES regulations. I believe that the UDO exceeded, so that's taken care of. My question is, what is the issue? If it's aesthetics, we can't regulate that. If it's parking, then we have leeway, and that is correct, which is why we're talking about parking today, is because it's a way for us to address this. In the 2040 comp plan, we had discussions for 6 years about density. People are moving to Charlotte, need attainable housing prices. The clearest path to that is building more units within the city's existing infrastructure. The UDO capped building heights in many places, and the trade-off supported by economic development study in the August 22 approved UDO was to allow more duplexes, tris, and quads in neighborhoods, much like we see in Charlotte's mature infill neighborhoods. If we have a UAC like not to allow density, I believe Allison called it density caps, then those new residents will be forced outward. So today we're talking about the infill lots, but John, that's from last week, and please listen to the meeting from last week, and we'll resend out the survey, because that's what we talked about last week, and would really like to hear your feedback after you hear some of the ideas, because it's not just about density caps. Julie, I need to run, and we'll send you a copy of the presentation. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Mark said, or parking lots in the back. And Tony said, wearing my NCDOT hat. I agree with John about avoiding sprawl. Thank you all for the chat comments.
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I'll just quickly, Roger, sorry to jump in front of you, but my point in making that is comment, and we don't develop any residential, so this isn't a professional, I have no bias here. We have to create more units within our city so that we don't sprawl outward and have to create more infrastructure. And whatever the best solution, it's a qualitative thing, it can't be based on aesthetics, but you certainly don't want cars spilling into the street. And, if you have a triplex where you have, 2 teenagers and 2 adults that have jobs that have to drive, you might have 3 cars, and you have to accommodate that. What's the best way to accommodate that? I mean, I'm not sure. I know it's not pretty to have driveways in the front. It's probably more, you have a more attainable housing price when the driveways are in front. But those options that you pointed out, that's more for the civil engineers and folks to debate. I think you've got plenty of room in those setbacks to put trees. I don't know that, and that's a regulated thing. You have to have trees every X feet. You have to have storm water every X feet. So my big push is, let's just make sure we get as many units within our neighborhoods. And I thought there was something in the UDO about putting those on more arterial streets or on corners, but to me, it's all about the density, because if we can't put those people in Charlotte, they're coming, then they're going to spill out into the surrounding cities and counties, and that creates Atlanta. So that's my soapbox. I'm fascinated by the 6 solutions you guys provided, and leave it to the experts to determine what's the best on that front. Sorry again, Roger, to jump in front.
Yeah, and John, real quick, if you can, you and I see Carolyn, and I think Dennis and Mark weren't here last week, and I'm not sure if I missed anybody else, but if y'all can listen and provide feedback. I wanted to also mention too, going back to, before I jump to the raised hands, going back to what we're talking about with infill, the greenfield side or the undeveloped side that we were talking about last week, I don't think a lot of other cities have experienced that like Charlotte has. But the infill, of course, is, other cities have done, and they do have development standards that they've developed over time to to ensure compatibility. And so, and they, of course, every state has different allowances in terms of what you can and cannot regulate, but everyone has different things that they regulate. And so Charlotte's trying to figure out what's best for Charlotte. And so that's really what the conversation is about today. So let's see, I have Roger and then Eric, and I'm trying to figure out who else has their hand raised, and Andrea. Okay. Matt.
Let everyone else go before me, since I already.
Who was second?
I believe Matt should go next.
I can go to
Thank you.
Allison. I appreciate the creativity that you're applying at these solutions. Some of them are interesting. Some of them have got some concerns about it. I think it's worthwhile just remembering that we can't pretend that cars don't exist. I think one of the things that happens is, if we reduce parking requirements or prohibit parking on site, it ends up getting pushed out onto the streets or the street around the corner or down the road and starts to affect other people. So I think, I think the one example that talked about not giving you any credit for space where you could park a car on the property. I think I understand the idea, but it would feel like it would just displace cars down in front of, the neighbor's house and cause problems for them. I thought that skinny driveway with the flared out to allow access to the garage or to two garages or whatever might be a reasonable solution. We've done that on some projects where we've needed more square footage for code trees, like I was talking about earlier, and it seems to be reasonably successful. As I'm laying out sites, when we push the parking around to the back, it's feeling like we're paving everything, because you've got the pavement in the front and then the pavement and maneuvering space in the back, and it's a trade-off just to think about. And another possibility might be, in addition to like I was talking about with the structural tree planting solutions, there are other types of pavement. There's like grass pave and things like that allow turf to be used, but it's still structural, but it looks like grass when there's not a car parked on it. Just some ideas, that's all.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. I mean, any of those materials or ideas, please send to us, and it's something that we could take a look at. And I think actually Sarah Hazel has a grant right now. I think it's called like Smart Surfaces, and looking at more sustainable surfaces. I think there may be a couple people on the call here that are involved in that, but that would be helpful if you could send. Eric.
I think Andrea was before me.
Thanks, guys. I'm sorry. I'm not doing a very good job of tracking the order, so thanks.
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate the 6 different slides shown with so much detail, so we can clearly envision what you're describing. And I just want to make sure that I'm understanding, we're talking about infill and not a new planned subdivision.
Correct.
Am I
Yeah.
understanding correctly? Okay,
Yeah.
great. So I think the thoughtfulness going into this in terms of the pedestrian environment and just the maintaining and promoting a neighborhood character is really valuable. And one thing, I guess, since this is talking about infill that I'm thinking through is if you are proposing basically parking pads, large parking areas to the rear of these infill units, how does that impact the neighboring properties? And in terms of quality of life, not just for the public pedestrian aspect, how is that impacting either diminishing or making better the green space, the yard availability, places for kids and families to play that is off street for these units? I think that it's not just a public area that needs to be considered. I think it's also the impact on the surrounding established residences. And if you were living next to essentially a parking lot with potentially 4 to 6 cars back there, what does that do to the rest of the neighborhood and folks living around those infills? So when I look at option like option 2 and option 6, it just the impervious surfaces and the large parking pads really seem to detract from potentially the other established lots around that. And if, again, if there isn't, well, let me just restate, I appreciated the consideration for increasing open space in our discussion last week because it allows for more green space, it allows for more potential walking areas, parks, that kind of flexibility instead of just concrete. So I think this may diminish that goal if you are increasing the allowable impervious. I guess the last question I had is, given all of the sections of the UDO that that factor into this, which ones take precedence when a proposal comes in? Is it stormwater runoff? Is it NCDOT and the number of curb cuts on a certain artery? What takes precedence in determining what design is allowed to go forward? That's it.
Do you want to explain, Allison? I was going to just mention the UDO administrator and kind of the role for some of that. Anyways, when we have conflicting pieces like that we have a process in place to kind of have a vetting, right, of what does take precedent. So if there is trees required, fire access, stormwater, kind of when all of those potentially conflict, there's a role of a UDO administrator to provide that guidance as to what direction in which we go. That's from the regulatory side. Obviously, there's a much bigger discussion from the policy side, right? Of like, what are our priorities as a city and what's like the highest priority? And, because if everything's a priority, then nothing is. So at some point we do have to value things, right? Based on council, based on the 2040 plan.
And I would add to Andrea, like you and I saw in the chat, Mark didn't like the 2 parking areas in the back. And I think that's really what we're wrestling with here is that when you have, I'm going to use a triplex just because it's easier. When you have a triplex with 3 families and you could have, 5+ cars there, we can't require you to have a garage. And so the cars are either in the front on the street if that's allowed or in the back. And so that's the reality of what of where they would go. And so the question is, do we need to make a change to where they're currently allowed? Because the previous slide earlier in the deck, it was an example where they're in the front.
Yeah, I just like to say, I think it's just a matter of trade-offs and different preferences for different people. And I'm particularly thinking about the parking in the back. And anyone who's worked with me is tired of hearing this, but I bought a house, previous home I owned, that had a quadruplex next door. And I didn't know it was a quadruplex until I moved in, but they did park in the back. And, you know, that was the folks that lived there weren't necessarily looking for yards in a more suburban environment, but it wasn't, I don't think it was terribly any more impactful than someone maybe having a pool in their backyard. And, you know, there are lots of things that can happen in a backyard that would cause noise and so forth. I mean, it, again, you know, the design of things, you may be able to accomplish both with parking in the rear, but it's trade-offs no matter what. It is a stormwater challenge that we've been talking about. So no, that's why we're here with you guys, because there's no clear, easy answer to all of this, or we would have brought that to you a while back.
Let's see, Eric, are you next?
Think so. And yes, Laura, that's right. It is very difficult. I think that's the theme of trying to balance all of these pieces in a way that makes sense. One question I have is that some of these examples, right, they're not all of the possible options, correct? Like if you had some parking in the back, they could also have garages back there, or ADUs, right? Or no, or rear loading garages from the back, not the front of the main structure.
You could.
Yeah. So there
Yeah,
is other options too, that if they may not be exactly like this in terms of if there was only one, like in option number 2, one driveway, it could look a little bit different from exactly what was presented. And the only other thing I would say, earlier comment about, you know, we can't regulate where if there's garages and all that. I understand that from John's comment, but we also can't mandate affordable housing either. But what we do is we try to encourage it. So we can do the same thing with this as well, is trying to find ways to encourage better design and not making snout houses everywhere when they get built these days compared to how they were built decades ago, right? One other thing that's been bothering me from last week to this week is some of these options presented, and it goes back to this problem that, you know, our neighborhood 1 A through E basically could occur anywhere in the city, right? And these conditions are more appropriate in different areas, right? If you have a more urban area, you're closer to a center, a neighborhood center, you're maybe in a more traditional, the first inner suburbs of uptown area, that you would prefer, in what's already on the ground looks like some of these standards, right? And the problem we're coming across is trying to fit all of these things across the board to every single neighborhood 1 A, B, C, D, E that occurs anywhere. And it really has to be done depending on the location and where it's located at. So it's an appropriate, you know, design paradigm for that area. That's what's been stuck. And I'm trying to figure out if there's a way of getting that implemented. It may be impossible, but it just seems to me that makes more sense that, you know, if this was a more walkable, less, you know, dependent on cars, then it should have the standards that fit that. And if it's out where there is no infrastructure to support transit or greenways or anything, and you're only forced to drive and you have to have 3 or 4 cars, then it should look a different way, right? I know that's my 2 cents. I don't know exactly how that all fits into this, but to me, it just is kind of like, and I mentioned this last week, and I know Monica, you know this, the transect, right? You don't outlaw the use. It just changes as it goes from transect to transect to transect, right? It just looks, the form of that changes. And that's kind of the same thing here is, depending on where this neighborhood, residential, duplex, triplex, single family, depending on where it's located at, the driveway will look different, right? Like the trees look different as you go from a rural, suburban to your urban to your center core. That's my piece.
Just an interesting point on that, is we've been doing some looking research around those patterns, and lot width, at least in Charlotte, is a pattern. I mean, you have newer neighbors that have more, 50-foot, 60-foot lots, but you can see patterns around time built by looking at that. If you combine lot width and setback, basically, you can kind of put neighborhoods into buckets as to when they were developed and how they were developed.
The key is just how to zone that, right?
Yeah, I think the challenge too, though, is like the patterns don't necessarily like relate to the zoning districts, so it gets complicated.
Right. Like an overlay is what I can only think of.
Thanks, Eric. Dennis, I'm sorry if I'm out of order.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Allison. First, thanks for all the hard work kind of putting the different potential standards together. I mean, the visual certainly helps me just kind of understand, kind of what's going on, and translates the words to images for me. Just a couple comments and questions, or maybe a few. So on this potential, well, overall, would this apply to the duplexes and triplexes? Are you considering these to all be on one lot, or are you considering any sort of sublot requirements or implications when you put these on sublots? And so specifically why I'm asking is like option one, I'm just looking at kind of the maximum width of the driveway between the setback and the right of way at 12. If these were on individual kind of sublots, you may want to look at that maximum dimension, because you could have some folks starting to kind of encroach on the other person's property, so to speak. And while that's kind of in the weeds right now, and everybody's all happy when they buy the house, that could be an issue just later down the road to think about. Also, on these options, I'm still kind of not seeing how any sort of any sort of townhomes or triplexes that would have garages in the front, and really 2-car garages in the front is addressed. So that kind of seems to me like there's still the desire to push those parking areas to the rear of the site. Am I getting that right?
I think that's fair to say. We did, though, with, I think it was the last one, if we can go to that one, Alan, depending on, the one before the last one, you had it right first time. Yeah. I mean, that gives you more flexibility in this case. You could have 2-car garages, I believe, depending, you'd have to work through the design on 2 of those units, if that's what you wanted to do.
Okay, and so I guess is there a width requirement of that parking pad area that's behind the setback, but between the setback and the unit 2 and 3?
No,
At that point,
okay,
you don't
Yeah.
have
there would not
limitation
be,
anymore.
Dennis, and maybe what I should have done there is to illustrate that units 2 and 3, if you made the units a little bit wider, you could accommodate a double wide garage in each of those and widen
Okay.
that driveway out.
Okay. No, I appreciate the clarification. And just the kind of last item for me is on potential new standard 4 is the 75-foot lot width minimum is kind of where did that originate, or how did you all get to 75 feet as minimum lot width?
40% would give of 75 feet would give you the 30 feet. So we're maintaining that 40%, but not that 24-foot maximum.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I just, and you all probably have the statistics and data on this. I would just kind of question how many lots do we have that are really meeting the 75-foot minimum width when we think about trying to, I want to be careful with using the word incentivize, but encourage infill density to help with some of the housing issues that we've all experienced, and really it's happening nationally. But I just wonder if 75-foot minimum is a bit wide, and maybe there's a different dimension that's a little narrower than that could work for the triplex.
Yeah,
it may require looking at that 40% though.
Yeah, I think maybe that information that Monica has, but I think there are probably more than we realize kind of middle ring subdivisions that don't have the deed restrictions, that have lots that are this wide.
And Laura, if I can just make another point that I know we've talked about, if you're going to do a triplex with side-by-side units, and then you've got a 5-foot minimum side yard, you almost, unless your triplex units are very narrow, you may need 75 feet to put 3 side-by-side units of, a normal width into a single lot.
Yeah, you get there pretty quickly.
Yep. Appreciate it, y'all.
Thanks, Dennis.
Roger.
Yeah, I may bounce around here a little bit, and I may need Matt to chime in, because that last comment about 25 foot units, is Matt, as you're laying, are there skinnier units out there? Because I got to imagine the garage can be 12 feet, and then you just have a foyer and stair going up. There's probably units like that.
Yeah, I mean, when you dissect townhomes, I mean, the smallest ones that we've done are 16 feet, and those typically almost must need to be 3 stories, because the first floor is like garage, and then stairs up to the second floor, and the second floor is living space, and the third floor is bedrooms. So I think you run into some sidewall issues unless you can do them in the attic, with dormers and things like that for an infill condition like this. 20s end up having 2-car garages, and often they've got some heated space on the ground floor opposite the garage. It might be an office or a bedroom or something. But then, 24 starts to get to be, the size townhome that could be a 2-story or 2.5-story without too much difficulty.
And do you think a lot of the developers out there are pushing 2-car garages, or like that's what the market is demanding, or is this kind of one in the chamber, one in the driveway?
In certain price points, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get away with the tandem garages sometimes. We were talking with a builder yesterday, and they pointed out that certain price points, the tandem won't sell. They want side by side. And so it's sort of all over the place, and some of it's tied to location too. It's arguable that if you're building duplexes or triplexes is up close to the university area, you might have 3 college students living in there. So you might have 3 cars instead of a single, you know,
Mhm.
professional with 1 car and a garage full of, you know, furniture and boxes. It's all over the place, really.
Yeah. I mean, I guess where I was gonna start off is it's tough. There's so many variables, but if we just like focus on how do you, the walkability, and the pedestrian experiences has kind of been, one of the things that seems to be, maybe driving some of this. And I just wonder, you know, these driveways aren't like the Chick-fil-A driveway, right? There's not a lot of traffic going in and out. You know, for the most part, it's going to be in the morning and it's going to be, in the evening, and or to soccer practices. So I'm not, yeah, I personally am not worried about like, oh, there's a lot of driveways. And it gets more to the, because of traffic, it gets more to the feel. With that example where you showed, the kind of modern townhouse, part of that issue with that image was it was really close to the street as well. Yeah, it almost felt like it was more an alley than a street. But with the 27-foot setbacks, it looks like for these things, in the N1s, there's got to be a way to, so like that one, it doesn't even look like it has an 8-foot planting strip. So I'm wondering, with that 8-foot planting strip, but being cut up, is there, something that we can almost like, in some areas we have this 2-foot utility easement behind the sidewalk. Is there a 3-foot planting easement where, if you can't hit the trees, spacing because of these driveways, you start kind of staggering them on either side of the sidewalk. And just from a, practical pulling out sense too, I always wonder, having those trees right there is, super great for, the car pulling out. But if it's the pedestrian experience, I think, just me personally, the one with the flare looked good. If behind a certain line, the staggering, number 5 of the units, I think, would really kind of helps the experience as well. And Alan, I think what you're saying is like, you could say, hey, unit 2 and 3 is maybe, maybe that's like a whole unit and you get a double car garage there, or you're doing a single, double, and a single, and you're just flaring that out, once you get, pushed back enough.
Yeah, the idea is you wouldn't be restricted to any width once you get beyond that established.
Once you get
setback
beyond that.
line. So you could do.
And
single
that makes
garages,
sense. I
double,
mean,
circle.
I'm not the expert, Matt. You've probably been looked at every lot in the city, but I was just spinning around Polaris there, and it seems like a lot of the Allison, as you're saying, the middle ring neighborhoods, right? The old suburban, that was old suburbia, 40 years ago. It seems like they're like around 180 feet deep for the most part. Maybe 150 in some cases. So it's like, it takes away from the backyard of these units, but honestly, people going into townhomes, they aren't expecting huge, or they shouldn't be expecting huge backyards, where they're gonna, have the giant poolscape and play set. So I think kind of shoving stuff back into the lot, may help that street experience a little bit more. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I think following on that, one of the things that we haven't talked about today that I do appreciate in imagery in the conversation here is a lot of the unit form that we're talking about is essentially a townhome type unit. And that's what a lot of the market wants. It's one of those things that fits into the building code in a way that helps with affordability. It also helps with ownership because you can put it on a sublot and sell the land and somebody can own it outright, which is all good. I wonder if what Roger's talking about, because again, these infill lots are different from greenfield sites that are being developed from scratch. I was looking at some older, 1920s era quads and sixplexes and things like that, just trying to see how they were put together and what is in the way today that prevents that from happening. But, I'm curious if you had those 180-foot deep lots, if getting two side by side gives you the elbow room to get the vehicular circulation behind it and still have enough width for viable units. If what happens is you start hitting some of the stormwater triggers for stuff, and so that disincentivizes people from putting lots together and sharing driveways. I don't know, just something that popped in my head while Roger was talking.
I'll also say this, don't underestimate the value of a driveway to kids. For some reason, they always want to be out front playing in a driveway. So, I mean, that's where the basketball courts usually, go. So, I know they're impervious and a lot of times they hold cars, but a lot of times that's where a lot of the kid activity happens too. It's amazing. They got backyards, but they want to be in front. I don't know why.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the big conversation is, trying to find the right balance, and between, existing neighborhoods, and the feel, like, I mean, it's hard to exactly capture what that is, but it is a feel. And so making sure we're allowing them where it's appropriate, but I think that as I'm looking at other cities, there's just a lot of different things people are doing and they have different regulatory frameworks. So, I mean, that's why we're here before you all, is to have this conversation. I don't know if there's anybody else on the call that hasn't had a chance to chime in. Encourage you to do that if you haven't. Oh, Carolyn. Yeah, Carolyn.
Hey, I'm sorry I missed the last meeting. I'm trying to play catch up here, so that's why I'm not saying a whole lot. But just a couple of comments. I saw that Eric put in the chat about that's what parks are for, and that's true. I'm in an older neighborhood. We do have a park, but these days most parents aren't going to let their kids, unfortunately, just go to the park. They'd rather have them in sight where they can see them. So that's why they're playing in their front yard or in the driveway. And we have many that play basketball in the driveway. With the triplexes and duplexes, what I'm hearing, and I may be wrong, but so far the comments I've heard have been more like triplexes and duplexes that are being built in infill for home ownership. But we're also seeing that many are for rental use. And, you have a one-car garage. Utopia, nobody would use a car, but we know our transportation system in Charlotte is probably 20 to 30 years behind on our utopia world. So human nature is people are going to need cars to get where they need to get from A to B. We are seeing, if you drive through different neighborhoods, I'll give an example, Amherst over in Oakhurst development, they have the little driveways, but you're seeing that you can't walk sidewalks because the cars don't fit in the driveways. They've got more than one car. They can put one in the garage And then if they have two more or they have visitors, they're blocking the sidewalk. We have people that park across the sidewalks. They park in the tree planting space. I know it's against the ordinance, but that's human nature. They're going to park where they need to park or want to park. You get into a rental situation. I like where the duplex has one, the first one towards the front of the setback, where it allows for the next two to maybe have a flared driveway, which is great. But I look, if it's a rental unit, and knowing what I've seen, you've got now two rental units and people fighting over that one flared space with no division in it. I do like back parking with the garage on the back, or back parking if it's limited in the space like you do the front. I understand with development and money and cost, a single garage is better on money. But realistically, if you've got more than one person, one adult living in a house, chances are, unless you're up close to uptown near the blue line, you're going to have more than one car. So these are just my concerns, and I'll go back and listen to the meeting from last week that I missed. And hopefully I can come up with some more thoughts from there. But thank you, guys.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I wanted to mention too, you mentioned home ownership and rental, and I said earlier we can't regulate that. But some of the things we've been talking about are when the units are put on sublots, or even requiring the units to be put on sublots, really helps to create a scenario where it's easier and it's set up for conveying ownership. And one of the challenges that I have with some of the triplexes that we're seeing is that because of the shared driveways, technically you can sublot those units and sell them, but you're sharing driveways, and you can have your neighbor go to bed and you're trying to go somewhere and you're stuck in your driveway. So I think those things are really challenging when you talk about trying to share that space, but at the same time, I think for me it's about the impervious surface and the extent of it in front of the unit, as well as the cars that I have concerns about in terms of neighborhood character, which is why we're trying to bring this conversation to you all. And it's tough stuff that we've been talking about for months. And I don't think clearly it's not an easy solution. John. John, and then Eric.
Can y'all hear me? All right. It seems we're getting into a lot of things, like we're using the word should and very opinionated things. And I've got opinions on, affordable houses versus $1 million houses and home ownership versus rental. But I don't know that that's the purview of the ordinance to dictate those subjective wants. Is that for 50 people at a UAC to decide? It probably is for 11 people on a city council to decide. But do we, Allison, you said you don't like it when you have a bunch of impervious area in front of a place. I agree with you. I didn't like it either. But if it meets the stormwater regulations and it meets the tree ordinance that we spent a lot of time debating, is that our purview to get into those subjective areas of what it looks like and what it feels like? I completely agree with the comment. My son lives in Gainesville, Georgia, in a little triplex that's in a neighborhood full of triplexes, and they didn't make, I can't remember the woman whose name just talked, Carolyn. They didn't make the driveway deep enough to park between the sidewalk and the driveway door. So all of the cars that park outside of the driveway or outside of the garage block the sidewalk, and it's a mess. But regulating things like that, like the distance between the sidewalk and the garage door should be 22 feet or whatever length of a car is. That's common sense, objective criteria. But when we start shooting the topic like if we should all over this thing, I think we're stepping way outside of the bounds of what a regulation is supposed to do. And I just would really caution us to interject our opinions onto what something should look like, because we aren't allowed to do that, or rental versus ownership, or $1 million houses versus $200,000 houses. And I've got opinions on all those things too, but I think we should follow the regulatory framework of the subdivision laws, the tree save, stormwater, all those things that we talked about. And again, I think we have a decision as a city as to whether we want to create density within our city, which triplexes and duplexes do. It's probably a bigger issue on the greenfield sites that you talked about last week, or if we want to eliminate duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes because they create these problems, and the people who are moving into the area 100 at a time will then move to where there's housing options. I mean, that's the big thing to me. And then the like all of those 6 options that you guys proposed, extremely creative, kudos to your staff. Like if all of those meet the current regulatory framework, then give the developer, give the homeowner, it might be, Mr. or Mrs. Smith who are redeveloping their home. It's not always a developer. Give them choices to meet what the market wants, and then let the market, the 100 people a day that are moving into our city, decide whether they want to buy outside the city limits, outside the county limits, or if they want to, rent a duplex. But I guess let's talk about the objective things that the ordinance contemplates, and hopefully every option that you guys put up there meets the current ordinance, as opposed to the subjective things, because those are just a matter of opinion. And we'll all have different opinions.
I mean, in some ways, John, and they are subjective and they are opinions, but there's also direction from the comprehensive plan too, that about what these places are supposed to look and feel like. And so we're well within all of the policy, otherwise we wouldn't be even here proposing any of this stuff. But we are getting questions, and so it brings the questions then to, should we consider changes? So thank you for your comments. I'm glad you could be here today.
But isn't the number one thing the comprehensive plan talked about was equity within our community and affordability? I think that was value number one. And again, that's not necessarily, that's not my business. But anyway, that's what the comprehensive plan said. So if we're being guided by that, now there were 6 or 8 things underneath that were also priorities, but do we want to reforce rank those priorities for traffic or bikes or pedestrian or 10-minute neighborhoods, or because you can't have it all?
No, I mean, I think Monica said that earlier today too. It was like, you can't have it all. And that's, some of the challenges that we're talking about is in implementation when you have some conflicting priorities that we're trying to manage. No, thanks, John. Eric?
Not to get in an argument with John, but I don't think stormwater is subjective, and especially if we go changing what was currently written, right, it's going to have consequences. So especially if you multiply it over hundreds or thousands of different houses, we allow more impervious surface, right? So I don't think that, just that point, I don't think that is subjective. That's a very measurable thing that if we change that, then we would have to go back and change stormwater possibly, right? So it doesn't create a negative consequence. But that wasn't my original comment. My original comment was, again, location based, but I live with only 1 car, but I have somebody renting. She has a car as well. We don't have a garage. We don't, we put a side driveway in, but our neighbors share a driveway with an easement, but they have a garage. But most of the time they have multiple cars. They use their garage. So there's ways that a lot of these neighborhoods have this existing home stock, and if we lose it and build it with something else, we're losing, some of that, what character we have, as everybody says. But there is conditions that people live perfectly happy without having, and desirable neighborhoods that they pay a lot as well for those houses to be there. So it's just I bringing that point out, meaning that, you know, none of those examples were shown with this, and there is some duplexes that also don't have that condition either, that have been built for decades. So it's just this, it seems like those solutions are off the table, even though they existed and people live in quite well. And if those get torn down and replaced by these, you know, then it's just a point that I wanted to bring out that seems to be lost in the conversation.
Thanks, Eric. I know we're getting short on time here. I've got Carolyn and Rob.
Thanks. Real quick, when I brought up the rentals, it wasn't rentals versus home ownership. One's better, one's not, one's equity, one's not. I was just bringing it up because a lot of times there's issues that come with a rental unit that may not come up with a home ownership unit. And I just wanted to, that's all that comment was. I agree with a lot of what Eric was just saying. This is just a very, very tough. And Allison, you and your staff, kudos to you, because this is a monster. I'll just say it. And when you're talking about infill neighborhoods that were built before the 60s, there's got to be a way to welcome people coming into Charlotte, having the affordability, having the availability, but also not running out the neighbors that have supported these older neighborhoods for decades. And I'm talking about generations. And we just want to be able somehow to find some type of balance, if at all possible, that provides us with an environment moving generations forward safely with trees, air quality, stormwaters, pedestrian safety, everything like that. And at the same time, providing housing. And that's a tough one. And I give it to everybody for stepping up. But I definitely wanted to let y'all know that my comment earlier was not being subjective to rental versus home ownership. Had nothing to do with that. So thank you, guys.
Thank Rob, then Roger.
Just real quick, Allison, did you guys, I appreciate the 6 different scenarios. Have you tested those along with the stormwater, trees, fire, some of those other requirements, just to see if they're actually doable? I know every parcel and every lot's different, but just to kind of get a sense, because I feel like the duplexes and tris and quads to some degree, and some of the established neighborhoods that we all talk about that we like and how they blend in, were done quite some time ago and probably could not be constructed under the current regulatory framework. So have you done any of that?
No, I mean, we're really just testing out, kind of where we want to take Charlotte with these changes. And certainly just like even more so with the conversation we had last week, I mean, we need to do additional testing. So I think it's really about providing additional feedback at this point. I mean, I think, so I'm going back to your comment, I'm trying to find it in here. In terms of stormwater, I think we recognize that there are some additional stormwater requirements when you have sort of the driveway and the parking in the back, and that's the balancing thing that we're trying to do. I think the trees is probably allowing for more trees. And then the fire aspect, I think what we've learned is that when the units are pushed so far back, it triggers the fire requirements, which it's not what I don't think any of us are really wanting to do. So I think looking at that, the distance between the unit and the setback or the street, I can't remember where it's measured from, is something that we have talked about, because I think that's an additional cost that is not something that we want, and we don't want those units that far back. So we have looked at that. So, but short answer, still evaluating.
Okay. And I'm just saying that because it may be that you kind of run the numbers, you do the math equation, you realize that some of these scenarios are just impractical when it comes to the majority or you know, kind of the average lot anyway. So why go down that road? That's all my thinking on that. So thank
Right
you.
now, like the way the driveway standards are for a triplex, it's impractical just the way that it's currently written. So if we decide that triplexes are important and valuable in our communities, the way that things are written right now, we're not getting a desirable outcome. So and I think it is making it challenging for triplexes. So so some of it is also about making sure we are getting what we sought to achieve in the beginning with the vision.
I understand, and I'm not even dealing with aesthetics. I'm just wondering if it's even possible to do some of these things just based on the requirements. That's all I'm suggesting, is that just needs to be looked at. So thanks.
Yep, thanks, Rob. Roger.
Yeah, I'll be real quick because we're out of time. Yeah, and I think Rob's point is if you take let's just test these on 100 by 180 foot lot, which seems to be kind of predominant in the mid ring. But also just kind of going to maybe Eric or a couple other people talking about, hey, let's identify areas where this is more appropriate. I'll go back to what I said last week. Then we're picking neighborhoods that you guys will get the triplexes. You stay as you are, and that feels really weird. Yeah, there could be all sorts of dynamics that come in there. That's it.
Thanks. Alan, if you'll go just the last slide really quick, just because we want to make sure, because I think I just dropped it in there. So I think we only got, actually, you can go to that one. Just, we only got 6 responses from last week's survey. So thanks to everyone that did respond. We really could use additional people weighing in. We're going to extend the deadline to March 1st and add some questions about today's conversation. So thank you for that. And I see Andrea's comment too. I'd be more than happy to continue the conversation of townhomes by right, because I don't think that we've allocated enough land for that. So Alan, if you go to the last slide now. So we're planning a meeting on March the 7th. We're trying to figure out what the second March meeting will look like in terms of dates. I know that the Equitable Development Commission meets, Carolyn, on the 3rd Thursday, right? So
Yeah,
I think we're trying to avoid
time.
that. Because not only are you participating, but there may be others that are wanting to listen or whatever. So we'll get back to you on when that next date is. But appreciate your time today. I know it's 1:01. We'll be sending out more information, and I really appreciate all of the feedback that you provided today. And I hope that you'll take a few minutes, if you didn't talk or you have other thoughts afterwards, to send us some additional feedback in the survey that we send you out later today. Thank you.